At 2 in the morning, Mason Reed's phone rang in the dark. On the screen was Charlotte Hayes, the chief executive who never called him after hours. Her voice sounded thin, and behind it he heard the steady beep of a monitor. "Can you please come to the hospital?" she asked. Mason did not ask why. He pulled on his coat, texted his sister, and drove through the rain without a single question. When he arrived, Charlotte was alone, her wrist wrapped in gauze, lawyers pacing outside. She looked at him and said, "You are the only one I trust." If you want to know exactly why Charlotte called Mason at 2 in the morning, stay with this whole story. It was 3 minutes past 2 when Charlotte's call came through, and Mason had already been half asleep for hours. What unsettled him first was not that his chief executive was calling him, but that Charlotte Hayes almost never called anyone directly, let alone in the middle of the night. Her voice was small on the line, stripped of the polish she wore in every meeting he had ever sat through. There was no order in it and no explanation. "Mason," she said, "can you please come to St. Matthew Hospital?" Mason looked at the clock, and he did not ask the questions most people would have asked. He did not ask what was wrong with her. He did not ask why she had chosen him. He did not ask whether this had anything to do with work at all. He simply answered that he would be there, and he meant it before he had even reached for his shoes. He called his sister Hannah first, waking her with a short apology and a shorter request, and within minutes she had agreed to look after the house so he could leave without worry. Outside, the rain was heavy, the kind that turned headlights into blurred halos on the windshield. As he drove, the strangeness of the situation began to settle over him more fully. Charlotte had an executive assistant. She had a driver on call around the clock. She had a legal team and a board of directors and hundreds of senior managers who answered to her every day. Why out of all of them had she called an engineer? Mason reached the hospital at 2:30. Outside Charlotte's room stood Grace Bennett, the company's head of legal counsel, along with 2 men in dark suits whom Mason recognized as advisors who occasionally sat in on board sessions. Grace looked surprised the moment she saw him walking down the corridor, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to alarm. "Who called you here?" she asked, her voice low enough that the 2 advisors would not hear. Mason answered simply that Charlotte had. The change in Grace's face was immediate and unmistakable, a flicker of something she tried to smother almost as fast as it appeared. It was the first small detail that told Mason he had just stepped into something far larger than a hospital visit, though he could not yet say what that something was, only that the air in the hallway felt heavier than it should have, and that Grace kept glancing toward the closed door behind her as though she expected it to open at any moment and change everything again. Mason had worked at Hayes Medical Systems for more than a decade, long enough to understand the unspoken rules that governed the higher floors of the company. Executives did not summon engineers to hospitals. Executives did not confide in the people who tested valves and reviewed calibration reports. He had spent his career in the quiet corners of the building, the ones with humming servers and pressure gauges instead of glass offices, and he had never once imagined that Charlotte Hayes even knew his direct phone number, let alone that she would use it before dawn. Whatever had happened to her that night, it had clearly pushed her past every layer of protocol she normally lived behind, and that alone told him more than any explanation could have. Charlotte lay in a monitoring room, hooked to machines that beeped in a slow, steady rhythm. She was not in critical condition. The attending physician explained that she had suffered a minor injury from a car collision, along with a level of exhaustion severe enough to require observation overnight. What struck Mason as strange was that Charlotte had refused to let Grace or any of the company directors into the room with her, insisting that she be left alone until further notice. When Mason finally stepped inside, Charlotte studied him for several seconds, as though she needed to confirm with her own eyes that he had actually come. "Are you okay?" Mason asked. Charlotte did not answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice carried something between disbelief and gratitude. "You didn't even ask why I called," she said. Mason answered plainly, "If you were well enough to explain everything over the phone, you wouldn't have called me at 2 in the morning." For the first time since he had entered the room, Charlotte's guarded expression cracked slightly, and something more honest showed through. She began to explain. The previous afternoon, she had received documents suggesting that a group of senior leaders intended to vote her out of the chief executive position the following morning. The plan was being led by Adrian Cole, the company's chief operating officer. But that discovery was not the most alarming part of what she had found. Charlotte had also uncovered that several safety testing reports connected to the company's newest cardiac device had been altered. If the product moved forward for approval based on that falsified data, patients could be placed in real danger, the company could face catastrophic consequences, and Charlotte herself could be positioned as the person who bore the blame. She had planned to bring the evidence to the board that same morning. Instead, her car had been struck later that night. There was no proof the collision had been anything but an accident, yet her laptop had vanished from the vehicle afterward, and her company phone was nowhere to be found. "Why me?" Mason asked. Charlotte looked at him directly. 7 months ago, you refused to sign off on a report that everyone else approved without hesitation. Mason remembered it clearly, a validation review for a pressure regulation system where he had written that there was not enough data to confirm the equipment was safe. At the time, he said, "I thought you were simply being difficult. Tonight, I understand that you were the only person in this entire company who was not afraid to tell it no." Charlotte's honesty seemed to cost her something to give. She admitted that in the years since she had taken over the company from her father, she had learned to keep almost everyone at a careful distance, treating trust as something that had to be earned in slow, measured increments, rather than given freely. Executives smiled at her in meetings and undermined her in private. Board members praised her publicly while quietly questioning whether a woman in her 30s could hold together an empire her father had spent decades building. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped expecting loyalty from anyone above a certain pay grade and had instead started watching for the rare few who told her uncomfortable truths without flinching. Mason, without ever meaning to, had become one of those few the moment he refused to put his name on a report he did not believe in. Charlotte explained that the evidence was not only stored on her missing laptop. Before leaving the office that evening, she had made a physical copy of everything and hidden it inside an envelope in Reliability Lab 4, tucked away where only someone familiar with the space would think to look. She could not simply send security to retrieve it. Adrian had spent the past several hours quietly gaining influence over the security division while she lay confined to a hospital bed, unable to move freely or make calls without drawing attention. Charlotte needed the envelope out of that lab before 6 in the morning, when the emergency board session was scheduled to begin. Mason understood the risk immediately. If he were caught retrieving confidential material from a secured facility in the middle of the night, he could lose his job, be accused of theft, or worse, become a suspect in whatever had happened to Charlotte's car. Charlotte did not order him to go. She only said that if he wanted to walk away, she would understand completely, and that she would never hold it against him if he chose to leave now and forget this conversation had happened. Mason stood still for a moment, weighing what she had just told him against everything he knew about the company he had spent years of his life inside. Then he asked where exactly the envelope was hidden. That single question marked the true turning point in whatever was forming between them. It was not romance, and it was not blind loyalty to a woman who signed his paycheck. It was trust built on something more durable than either of those things, a shared belief that certain principles mattered more than personal safety. Mason returned to headquarters just before 3:30 in the morning. The building stood almost entirely empty at that hour, its long hallways lit only by dim overnight lighting. His access badge still worked without issue. But the moment he stepped onto the engineering floor, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The building's access log showed that someone had entered Lab 4 at 47 minutes past 2, less than an hour after Charlotte had called him. Mason moved quickly toward the lab. One of the storage drawers stood slightly open, and the envelope was not where Charlotte had described it. For a brief sinking moment, he believed he had arrived too late, that whoever had come before him had already taken what they needed and vanished into the rain outside. After several minutes of careful searching, Mason realized that Charlotte had used a technique familiar to engineers who spent their careers labeling and filing calibration reports, tucking sensitive material behind panels rather than inside drawers anyone might open first. The envelope was actually resting behind a calibration documentation panel near the back wall, exactly the kind of place a person trained to think like a technician would consider, and exactly the kind of place someone unfamiliar with laboratory storage habits would overlook entirely. Mason pulled it free and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of paper that could either save a company or destroy it depending on whose hands controlled it by morning. He had barely tucked it inside his jacket when the corridor lights beyond the lab door flickered on, and he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the direction of the elevators. Mason did not run. He understood that running would instantly mark him as suspicious in a way that walking calmly never would. He closed the panel, picked up a nearby testing clipboard, and positioned himself as though he were in the middle of a routine equipment check. The man who rounded the corner was Adrian Cole, the company's chief operating officer, dressed as though he had never gone to bed at all. Mason, Adrian said, clearly caught off guard. 3 in the morning. Mason kept his tone even. The telemetry system flagged an alert, and I came in to check it. Adrian asked a few pointed questions about the equipment, testing whether Mason's explanation would hold together. Mason answered each one with precise technical detail, the kind that only someone who genuinely understood the machines could produce convincingly. Adrian could not find a crack in the story, though his eyes lingered a moment too long on the clipboard in Mason's hands. Before turning to leave, he offered a final remark. "If I were you, I would stay away from matters that are not your responsibility." Mason replied without hesitation, "Product safety is my responsibility." The two men held each other's gaze for a beat longer than necessary. From that moment forward, Adrian understood that Mason might know something he was not supposed to know. Mason carried the envelope out of the building and back toward his car. On the drive to the hospital, he checked his rearview mirror out of habit and noticed a dark sedan pulling out of the parking structure not long after he did. It was impossible to know whether this was coincidence or something more deliberate. Rather than driving straight back to the hospital, Mason took 2 extra turns through side streets before stopping briefly at an all-night gas station to see whether the sedan would follow. It continued on without slowing. Perhaps he had let his imagination run further than the situation required. Or perhaps whoever was behind him already understood that Mason was paying attention. When he returned to Charlotte's room, she was still awake, watching the door with an intensity that eased the moment she saw the envelope in his hand. For the first time that night, something in her posture finally relaxed. But Mason did not hand it over immediately. Instead, he asked her a question that had been sitting uneasily in his chest since the parking garage. What exactly is inside this envelope that would bring Adrian Cole to a laboratory at 3 in the morning? Charlotte went very still, because she had never told Mason that Adrian even knew where the documents were hidden. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the hospital monitor filling the silence with its patient, indifferent rhythm. Mason watched Charlotte's face carefully, the way an engineer watched a gauge for the first sign of pressure building past a safe threshold. He was not accusing her of anything. He simply needed to understand the shape of the danger they were both now standing inside, because a man like Adrian did not wander into a secured laboratory before dawn without a reason, and reasons like that rarely turned out to be small ones. Charlotte finally admitted that she did not know how Adrian could have learned about the lab, unless someone inside her own inner circle had told him, which meant the list of people she could still trust had just grown shorter by one more name than she wanted to admit. Charlotte and Mason opened the envelope together. Inside were the original testing data, approval emails, an editing log, and a technical warning report that had been quietly removed from the final submission. Mason studied the pages with the focused attention of a man reading a language only he fully understood. He recognized the electronic signatures of 3 engineers he had worked alongside for years. Some of the raw data showed that the prototype device could fail under continuous operation at elevated temperatures, a flaw serious enough that the original testing team had requested 6 additional weeks of evaluation before certification. Yet the version submitted to the board stated plainly that all validation requirements had been satisfied. Charlotte explained the pressure behind the decision. The device represented the largest project in the company's history. Any delay threatened to drop the stock price, unravel a pending partnership deal, and cost Adrian a bonus large enough to change his entire financial future. Mason asked the question that mattered most. "When did you find out?" Charlotte answered that it had been roughly 9 hours. That detail carried real weight. Charlotte was not an executive who had known about wrongdoing and quietly allowed it to continue. She had discovered the falsified data only the night before and had planned to halt the project first thing the following morning. Mason found one more document buried near the bottom of the envelope, an internal email suggesting that Adrian intended to shift full responsibility onto Charlotte if anything went wrong. His plan was layered and precise. The board would vote to suspend her. Adrian would step in as acting chief executive. Selected members of the press would receive documents suggesting Charlotte had pressured the engineering team into rushing approval. Adrian would then present himself publicly as the person who had uncovered the wrongdoing, while Charlotte absorbed the blame in his place. Charlotte realized only after reading it fully that her accident had occurred just hours before that scheduled vote. She did not want to say out loud that Adrian might be responsible, and Mason refused to let the story leap ahead of what the evidence actually proved. "We only have proof about the data," he told her carefully. "We do not have proof about the accident." That distinction mattered to Charlotte more than she expected. Mason was not telling her what she wanted to hear. He was telling her only what could actually be demonstrated, and somehow that restraint made her trust him even more than blind agreement ever could have. They spent the next hour organizing the pages into a sequence that would make sense to anyone who had not spent years buried in engineering reports, separating what was certain from what was merely suspicious. Mason insisted on labeling each document with the exact source it had come from, a habit built from years of defending his own findings in front of skeptical review committees. Charlotte watched him work with something close to fascination, realizing that the same careful precision that had once made him seem stubborn to her was now the very quality standing between her company and a scandal that could unravel everything her father had built. By the time the sky outside the hospital window had begun to lighten from black toward gray, they had assembled a case built entirely on facts that could be verified by anyone willing to look closely enough. Adrian did not wait for Charlotte to be discharged. At 7 in the morning, he summoned an emergency board session, citing the official reason that the chief executive was temporarily incapacitated for medical reasons. He proposed that the board grant him temporary operating authority until Charlotte recovered. Grace arrived at the hospital shortly before the meeting began. She urged Charlotte to sign a temporary authorization letter, and for a moment Charlotte suspected Grace had turned against her entirely. Instead, Grace quietly revealed the truth. Adrian had been building support for this vote for weeks, moving carefully behind closed doors. Grace had tried to slow him down without solid proof of wrongdoing, but she had never had enough evidence to stop him outright. She warned Charlotte plainly, "If you walk into that meeting with nothing but accusations, they will say the pain medication is affecting your judgment." Mason suggested a change in strategy. Rather than fighting over power or accusing Adrian of causing the accident, they would focus entirely on something that could be proven without dispute: the safety of the product itself. Charlotte joined the board session remotely through video, her voice steady despite the exhaustion still visible on her face. Adrian offered a performance of concern the moment she appeared on screen. "Charlotte, you should be resting. We can handle the company while you recover." Charlotte answered calmly, "I am resting, but first I want the approval of Project Meridian halted immediately." The room went silent. Adrian pushed back, insisting the project had already cleared every stage of certification. Charlotte corrected him. "No," she said. "A report was altered." Adrian asked whether she had proof. Charlotte looked toward Mason, who was sitting just off camera with the envelope resting on his lap. In that instant, Mason understood exactly why Charlotte had needed him beside her that morning. It was not simply to rescue her from a hospital bed. It was to provide an independent technical witness, someone Adrian could not easily discredit or dismiss as a loyal employee protecting his employer out of obligation rather than fact. Every member of that board knew Mason by reputation, a man who had refused to sign off on questionable data even when it cost him a promotion, and that reputation was about to matter more than it ever had before. Grace stayed close to Charlotte's side throughout the call, watching the faces of the other board members carefully for any sign of where their loyalties might actually lie once the pressure increased. She had spent years navigating the quiet politics of that boardroom, learning which directors valued the company's long-term reputation and which ones cared only about the next earnings report. As Adrian continued to insist that Charlotte's accusations were baseless, Grace noticed two of the older board members exchanging a brief, uneasy glance, the kind that suggested doubt had already begun creeping into a room Adrian had believed was firmly under his control. It was a small thing, easy to miss, but Grace had learned long ago that boardroom coups were rarely won or lost in the loud moments. They were won in glances like that one, quiet and almost imperceptible, minutes before anyone said a word out loud. Charlotte was not yet strong enough to leave the hospital, so Mason was asked to carry the documents to headquarters himself, with Grace accompanying him for the walk into what quickly became one of the tensest rooms he had ever entered. When Mason stepped inside, Adrian tried immediately to diminish his presence. "Mr. Reed is an engineer, not a member of this board," he said, glancing around the table as though inviting agreement. Mason answered without raising his voice. "That's correct. Which is exactly why I don't care who sits in the chief executive's chair. I only care whether this data is real." The room shifted at that single sentence. Mason walked the board through each finding in careful order, laying out the missing testing phase, the temperature limits that had been ignored, the discrepancies between the original file and the final submission, the altered timestamps, and the warning that had been quietly deleted before the report ever reached anyone outside the engineering floor. Adrian attempted to dismiss it all as a minor technical disagreement, the sort of thing engineers argued about constantly without it meaning anything serious. Mason delivered the detail that ended that argument for good. One critical test had been marked as passed on a date when the laboratory's own equipment logs showed the device had never even been powered on. There was no way around that fact. A passing result could not exist for a test that had never actually taken place, which meant someone had manufactured the outcome entirely. A member of the board immediately called for the project to be frozen pending review. Adrian's composure finally cracked. He turned toward Mason with open frustration. "You are destroying a company that has paid your salary for years." Mason met his eyes steadily. "If a company has to hide its data just to survive, then I am not the one destroying it." The tone of the meeting had fully reversed by the time Mason finished speaking. Directors who had arrived that morning ready to sign off on Charlotte's removal now sat quietly reviewing the printed pages in front of them, several of them flipping back and forth between the falsified report and the original data with visibly growing concern. Adrian tried once more to redirect the conversation toward Charlotte's judgment and her recent accident, hoping to shift focus away from the documents themselves, but the room had already stopped listening to him in the way it had only an hour earlier. The momentum in that boardroom, so firmly in Adrian's favor at the start of the session, had quietly and completely changed hands. Grace watched from her seat near the door, taking note of every director's reaction as Mason spoke, and later she would say it was the first time in years she had seen that particular room go completely silent for the right reason rather than the wrong one. It was not fear of Adrian keeping people quiet this time. It was the simple, uncomfortable weight of realizing that a company they had all trusted to test its own devices honestly might have let something dangerous slip through simply because slowing down had felt too costly. Mason did not raise his voice again for the rest of the meeting. He did not need to. He answered every remaining question in the same measured tone he had used from the beginning, and by the time the session adjourned, it was clear to everyone present that the vote scheduled to remove Charlotte from her position would not be moving forward as planned. Grace presented the remaining piece of evidence. Audit records showed that the edits to the testing report had originated from the account of a deputy director working directly under Adrian. Adrian immediately tried to place the blame entirely on his subordinate, insisting he had no knowledge of what that employee had done. But Charlotte, still watching through the video connection from her hospital bed, asked the question that mattered most. "Then why were you in Lab 4 at 3 in the morning?" Adrian fell silent. Mason had already noted the exact time of their encounter, and the building's security log confirmed Adrian's badge had accessed that floor at that hour. Adrian claimed he had gone to check on an equipment issue. Mason asked him plainly what issue that might have been. There was no maintenance ticket. There was no alarm recorded in the system. There was no request on file from any department for equipment service that night. Adrian had no answer that held together under that level of scrutiny. Even so, the story never tipped into wild accusation or unfounded conclusions. No one in that room claimed with certainty that Adrian had caused Charlotte's accident. Instead, the evidence was sufficient to suspend him from his position, open an independent internal investigation, secure all remaining data before it could be altered or destroyed, halt the compromised project indefinitely, and notify the appropriate regulatory authorities as required by law. The vote to remove Charlotte from her position was formally withdrawn. The board instead voted to suspend Adrian pending the outcome of the investigation. Before leaving the room, Adrian turned toward Mason one final time. "All of this because she called you," he said, his voice thin with disbelief. Mason answered without hesitation, "No, because the data was real." That single exchange marked Mason's true victory that day. He had not protected Charlotte out of personal feeling or misplaced loyalty. He had defended what was true and demonstrable, refusing to let the outcome hinge on anything softer than facts that could withstand scrutiny from anyone willing to look. It was precisely that refusal to bend the truth for anyone, including the woman who had called him at 2 in the morning, that would later give whatever grew between them a foundation far steadier than most relationships ever managed to build. Security escorted Adrian from the building later that afternoon, and word of his suspension spread through the company faster than any official memo could have managed. Some employees expressed disbelief that a man so polished and so carefully spoken could have been capable of something like this, while others admitted quietly that they had always sensed something calculating beneath his charm, something they had never quite been able to name. Charlotte, still recovering, asked to be kept away from the internal gossip entirely, more concerned with what the independent investigators would find in the coming weeks than with how the story was being told around the coffee machines on each floor. Mason returned to his usual routine almost immediately, running diagnostics and reviewing calibration logs, as though the morning's events belonged to someone else's life rather than his own. After the board meeting ended, Mason returned to the hospital. Charlotte had been moved to a standard room by then, the machines around her fewer and quieter than before. For the first time since the phone had rung at 2 in the morning, the two of them could speak without the board, the lawyers, Adrian, or a folder of confidential documents standing between them. Charlotte asked whether he understood that he could have lost his job over everything he had done that night. Mason answered simply that he did. She pressed further, "Then why did you still do it?" "I don't know," she added quietly. "Please, if there's an answer, I'd like to hear it." Mason thought for a moment before responding. "You called," he said. Charlotte gave a small, tired laugh. "That isn't really an answer." Mason met her eyes. "To me it is." When she asked him to explain further, Mason spoke briefly about his late wife, choosing his words with visible care. During the period when she had been seriously ill, he had come to understand exactly what it felt like to call someone in the middle of the night and hope, more than anything, that they would simply show up without demanding an explanation first. He had learned that in the worst moments of a person's life, the first question people asked was often the wrong one to lead with. What happened could wait. Where are you did not always need to. Charlotte admitted something in return. She had hundreds of contacts stored in her phone, executives and advisors and old friends from business school who would have answered her call out of professional obligation if nothing else. But sitting alone in that hospital room earlier that night, she had not thought of the chairman of the board, or her assistant, or her attorneys. The only person who had come to mind was Mason. Mason did not know quite how to respond to that. The two of them sat in a silence that felt different from every silence that had passed between them earlier that night, warmer and slower, without the urgency of falsified reports or emergency board votes pressing down on either of them. It was the first quiet moment of something neither of them tried to name yet, a small, careful beginning built on nothing more dramatic than one person showing up when it mattered and asking nothing in return. A nurse eventually came in to check Charlotte's vitals, and the ordinary rhythm of the hospital resumed around them, carts rolling past in the hallway, a distant intercom calling for a doctor on another floor. Mason stood to leave, promising to check on the situation at headquarters again before the morning shift began, and Charlotte watched him go with an expression she had not worn in front of anyone in a very long time, something closer to relief than exhaustion. She did not ask him to stay. She did not need to. The fact that he had come once, without being asked twice, told her everything she needed to know about whether he would come again if she ever had to call. The independent investigation concluded 7 weeks later. Its findings confirmed that the testing data had indeed been deliberately altered. Several managers connected to the falsified reports were dismissed from the company. Adrian lost his position entirely and faced ongoing legal proceedings related to his conduct. Investigators found no evidence connecting him directly to Charlotte's accident, and that final detail kept the story grounded in what could actually be proven rather than what felt satisfying to believe. Charlotte chose to publicly accept responsibility as chief executive for the failure of the company's internal safety controls, rather than distancing herself from the scandal or quietly hoping it would fade from attention. She halted the compromise project entirely, reported the falsified data to the appropriate regulatory bodies without being compelled to do so, and established a fully independent product safety division answerable directly to the board rather than to any single executive. She also granted the reliability engineering team formal veto authority over any product launch, a change that would have prevented the entire crisis had it existed a year earlier. Charlotte wanted to promote Mason to vice president. He declined the offer without much hesitation. He explained that he did not want to be rewarded simply for doing what he believed any engineer in his position should have done. Charlotte eventually proposed something that fit him more naturally, a newly created position called Director of Independent Product Reliability. Mason accepted that role, not because of any personal reward it offered him, but because it gave him the formal authority to shield engineers from the kind of business pressure that had nearly caused irreversible harm. Throughout the weeks of investigation that followed, Mason and Charlotte kept their relationship strictly professional. Neither of them raised the subject of what had passed between them in that hospital room, and both seemed to understand, without needing to discuss it directly, why that restraint mattered. Charlotte was still the chief executive, and Mason was still an employee whose career she now had significant influence over, and neither of them wanted whatever might eventually grow between them to be shadowed by any suggestion that position or power had played a part in it. It was a quiet, deliberate patience, one that made whatever came next feel earned rather than rushed. Mason noticed changes throughout the company in the months that followed, small ones that most employees might not have registered as connected to the events of that single night. Meetings that once rushed toward approval now paused for a second round of testing without anyone treating the delay as a personal failure. Engineers who once hesitated to raise concerns in front of senior leadership began speaking up more freely, aware that the woman running the company had proven, publicly and at real cost to herself, that she would rather absorb criticism than let a dangerous product reach the people who depended on it. Charlotte never spoke of that transformation as her own achievement. She credited it, whenever the subject came up, to the simple fact that one engineer had refused to sign a report 7 months before any of this began, and had refused again on the night everything nearly fell apart. Several months passed. Charlotte was no longer the entirely guarded, isolated woman she had been on the night everything began. Mason, in turn, had slowly come to see past the title she carried, recognizing the person underneath it more clearly with each passing week. One evening, after a late meeting had finally ended, the two of them left the building together. Charlotte asked whether he remembered the first time she had called him outside of work hours. 2:17 in the morning, Mason answered. Charlotte looked at him surprised. "You remember the exact minute?" Mason said simply that it was hard to forget. Charlotte laughed softly, and the tension that had once defined every interaction between them was nowhere to be found. She told him she wanted to have dinner together, and made clear it was not a working dinner, not a discussion about a project, and not a delayed thank you for what had happened at the hospital months earlier. It was simply dinner. Mason looked at her for a moment. "This time, do I get to ask why?" he said. Charlotte answered, "No, you don't." Mason smiled and agreed without further argument. Their story did not rush forward into anything dramatic after that. There was no hurried engagement, no sudden declaration of love spoken too soon to mean anything real, and no attempt to turn Charlotte into a replacement figure in Mason's private family life. What the story offered instead was simpler and steadier. Two capable adults who had earned each other's trust the hard way, choosing carefully and honestly to give each other a real chance. Charlotte had once believed that power guaranteed people would always come when she called. Running a company that carried her father's name had taught her that hundreds of people would answer a summons from the chief executive without a second thought, arriving out of obligation, ambition, or simple fear of what refusal might cost them. But the night in the hospital had taught her something else entirely, something no title or authority could ever manufacture. Hundreds of people would appear the moment Charlotte Hayes, chief executive, called them into a room. Only one person had come when Charlotte, frightened and entirely alone, called from a hospital bed at 2 in the morning, and Mason had never once asked her why. Long after the company had moved past the scandal, employees who had never met either of them personally still occasionally repeated a version of the story around the office, usually shortened and slightly altered with each retelling, the way stories tend to be. But the version that mattered most was never about a falsified report, or a boardroom vote, or a suspended executive escorted quietly out of the building. It was about a single phone call at 2 in the morning, and a man who had gotten dressed in the dark without asking a single question, because somewhere along the way he had learned that showing up mattered more than understanding why, and that some people simply deserved to be met halfway before anything else was explained. That, more than anything else that followed, was the reason Charlotte never forgot the sound of rain against a hospital window, or the sight of Mason walking through the door before she had even finished asking him to come.